Today in the EU, the cost of competitiveness.
And the message, dear colleagues, is dramatic. Thousands of jobs in Europe are in the near future under risk.
As voters cast their ballots this spring in European elections, one issue was undermined, mainly the economy. Now, the newly elected College of Commissioners assumed office with a clear mission, crafting a more competitive Europe, one that can keep pace with the United States and China. But in the drive for global competitiveness, labor and social policies appear to be taking a backseat. How does the European Commission plan to deliver on making the Union wealthier? And who risks being left behind? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. Today, I'm here in the studio with Economics Hub editor Anna Brunetti. Hi, Anna.
Hi, how are you?
So today, ministers are meeting in Brussels to talk labor shortages and social policy. It's the first time we hear this topic in a while, isn't it?
It is indeed. I guess the last few months have been all about the competitiveness agenda. We've heard a lot about competitiveness, single market, boosting the European economy, efficacy. So it's all been about boosting private funding capacity and the economic strategy to kind of make it more competitive vis-a-vis other jurisdictions like the US and China. But that has also meant that other very, very relevant topics have kind of been put on the back burner for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean, just Wednesday, von der Leyen restated once again that European competitiveness is going to be the compass for the next 5 years. And we had a look to the Draghi report just to go back to it once again to see what competitiveness looks like, and couldn't help but think, where is labor and social policy in this new agenda?
Well, that's a really good question indeed, because we haven't seen much of it. Of course, it's been mentioned by policymakers every time they've addressed the public or the wider public. It's always almost like a blank statement that they need to insert in whatever they say, because it's part of the fundamentals pillars of the European model. But if one digs a little bit deeper, it kind of disappears quite quickly from the broader competitiveness and capital markets union debate as well. There's quite a clear reason for that. Like, there's an underlying shift that is picking up momentum more and more. Mm-hmm. We've seen it starting from the first times we started hearing the CMU again.
The Capital Markets
Union. And after the Leyen and Draghi report, it's become clearer and clearer that really the next 5 years will be all about competitiveness.
I can announce that the first major initiative of the new Commission will be a competitiveness compass. This competitiveness compass will be the frame for our work for the rest of the term.
And really focusing on the economic strength of the European model against competing jurisdictions. But that kind of leaves on the side very important topics that have been at the core of the European model since it was funded. So when we talk about social policy and labor policy, we're talking about the very specific nature of the European model, which has always been quite different and peculiar and unique compared, for example, to the US and the UK, where since the 70s and the 80s, there has been a growth of like neoliberal and kind of like market-based capitalism, whereby the role of the state was much reduced. In Europe, the market-based economy was always merged and intertwined with a more traditional welfare state, where regulations and social protections were at the core of the functioning of the system itself. So you wouldn't have one without the other. If we think that, according to the Corporate Europe Observatory, for example, as much as 65% of the Draghi report recommendations and statements come from companies and business organizations, while only 5% of them were actually tabled by civil society organizations and trade unions. So there's a huge discrepancies there. If we think about these figures, for example, Lee Anderson, the chair of the Economic and Social Affairs Committee, from the left group. She said if competitiveness comes to mean mainly corporate interest, the outcomes will be destructive, she said, for the EU social model. That's why it becomes really important to think about what are the funding pillars of the EU social model. And that's when we go and start thinking about the merging of, market-based economy with social protections and the welfare state.
Before we get into what consequences could look like, I'm interested in digging a bit deeper into the reasons. So, for instance, the report and this whole new narrative on competitiveness focuses on getting more investments in, making the European market stronger. Is it because, if we look at our unemployment rates, they're plateauing around 6%. Is it because we're doing good labor policy-wise, and therefore we don't need to put extra emphasis on it in this new mandate?
No, certainly no. No, I guess different economists and different political parties will give you very different answers to that question.
Yeah.
So I'm in no place to give you an authoritative answers to that. But surely, if we look at the realities of member states and like the economic fabric of different countries, we are facing major challenges in the workforce and in the workforce fabric of traditional industries, for example, are challenged by enormous secular crisis. Like I'm thinking about energy intensive, or we can think about the automotive sector.
Yeah, Weber mentioned the car industry and how many jobs will be lost just last week.
If we then go back to labor policies and the labor issue, it's not only the traditional left-wing parties or the unions that are worried about it, but we've seen Weber taking it up really strongly, and we see large business associations like Confindustria in Italy advocating for a much stronger industrial policy. Because, of course, we are really facing the risk of seeing mass layoffs, and that would in turn create not only huge economic problems, but social and cohesion problems as well. But I guess that the questions that are at stake at the moment might not only be tackled and solved through a competitiveness agenda. And I guess what we're examining today, what we thought would be useful to examine is what is left out of the competitiveness discourse, what is like left behind, and what are the risks and the implication of leaving those topics and those conversations behind.
Especially because if we look at the mandate of the new College of Commissioners, there's not one person overseeing labor and social policy anymore. That's a mandate that used to be for one, now is fragmented. So can you explain to us how that's going to work and what that means for workers?
Yes, well, there's been quite an interesting dynamic we've seen throughout the political negotiations of von der Leyen new College of Commissioners. So initially, what caught everyone's attention is that for the first time since the 70s, the portfolio for labor and social rights completely disappeared. And it was basically rebranded and reshuffled into a wider portfolio, actually an executive vice president portfolio of Mizatu for skills and preparedness. But even in the title, the words labor or employment and social rights completely disappeared. And of course, that has an historical relevance that cannot be ignored. And of course, it didn't go unnoticed by civil society groups or by political groups, by unions that have worked on these topics.
Yeah, I mean, the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs asked Minsatu about concerns when it comes to this specific topic. And she replied that it will be a team effort then. She will work with Jorgensen on energy and housing, Lahabib on equality, and the list goes on and on. But at the end of the day, if there's nobody in charge of labor policy, what will be the Commission's line?
As we were looking at the political negotiations, the interesting thing is that there was a change because of such a shocking, let's say, shift even in the language and in the rebranding of the portfolios. I guess von der Leyen felt like she couldn't win a large enough majority if she didn't review that issue. And at the end, I guess like the unions and the parties that really advocated for making sure that the word and the notion of labor and social rights did not disappear from the titles of the commissioners themselves or the executive vice presidents.
And just to be extra precise, the true words were social rights and quality jobs. But yes, please continue.
They had a small but very important win when she talked at the Strasbourg plenary. She admitted that she had listened to those concerns and she decided to reinsert those two words in the title of Minzatu's portfolio. It could sound like a trivial matter and like a battle that was not needed. But in reality, to see something that vital disappear from even the language, it could be detrimental for the contents that are addressed in the next 5 years.
Going back to the language, we don't see labor policy being mentioned, but we see a lot of emphasis on skills. So isn't it the same thing?
What has been quite impressive, we did a word search throughout the main documents that determine the period of the commissioners' hearings. Ever since the von der Leyen mission letter to Minzatu, already the word skills was mentioned 24 times. But if we go to Minzatu written answers before her hearing, it's mentioned as many as 82 times. And that's a huge leap from, let's say, 5 years ago when Schmidt was the labor and social rights, was nominated commissioner for those competencies. And at the time, like, skills had been mentioned 16 times. So it's been basically, 6 times
as much,
if not more. And it's not just, again, it's not just a language matter. It's really about the content and the policy priority that we're going to see taking center stage in the next 5 years. When we talk about skills and preparedness, we're talking merely and squarely about employment, which means that suddenly social policy comes to be identified with employment and employability. So the focus of any policy efforts in that matter is going to be to enhance the employability of the workforce and of citizens, when instead the notion of welfare is much broader than that. And the original founding idea of the welfare state is to provide services, that the state can provide services to the less advantaged citizens that are not dependent on their ability to work and to participate in the workforce. So to focus on them that heavily means that suddenly you're rendering the value of welfare strictly dependent on how productive a society is.
Yeah, it's a way narrower definition of what welfare implicates.
Yeah, it's basically a different concept of welfare, and it's what, if you take a step back, it's been called commodification of welfare, whereby you make it dependent on the participation on the workforce. So it's important to not lose the broader picture view that kind of connects the dots of why continuing to talk about other social and labor policy issues should continue to be fundamental in the European model.
And what are workers' unions saying about this paradigm shift?
Well, the first reaction was clearly quite negative when von der Leyen in September announced the configuration of the new proposed commission. At the time, the Secretary General of the ETUC, which represents European unions, Esther Lynch, she quote unquote said that the proposals was full of portfolios that sounded like they had been drawn up on a corporate away day rather than in response to the priorities of working people. And it might sound like a bitter remark, but really she's talking about what we were talking about before. So the shift to a more neoliberal paradigm means that there's a lot at stake and a lot at risk for entire populations and workforce. So really, like, what we mean and what we're talking about here is really the livelihood and the economic and social prosperity of entire populations of workers.
And covering this topic, you've also been in touch with political groups, right?
We spoke briefly to Lee Anderson. She's the chair of the Employment and Social Affairs Committees at the Parliament from the left group. And she also agreed that the way that the portfolio had initially been designed for the mandate posed a lot of obvious risks, she said, because the kind of cross-cutting responsibilities were spread across different commissioners. And the risk was that the responsibility of the labor policy and social rights gets lost in this new redistribution of tasks, especially not being prioritized compared to other policy objectives. She also mentioned that apparently two of the main drivers for people to go to the ballots were the cost of livings and their economic situation.
And so taking into account all of these concerns that we've mentioned so far, how could this new competitiveness agenda shape incoming policy files?
It's an interesting consideration because she was basically thinking that that means that there's a big expectation from the voter for a strong policy in this area. So the cost of living crisis, labor policy, and there's a clear mandate there if the Commission wants to take it.
Thank you, Anna. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our newsletters, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. Don't forget to leave us a star review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This podcast was produced by Miriam Sainz de Tejada, Charles Cohen, and I. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.